In this chapter, we're going to talk about the pro-housing movement and its role in the political prospects for zoning reform at the local and state level. In the past few years, we have seen a remarkable growth in local and state pro-housing advocacy groups. They have changed much of the political debate, drawn more attention to this issue, and have brought about legislative wins in some states and localities, so actual zoning reforms that have been passed and that are in effect now. The pro-housing movement is very young, is growing very quickly, and is facing some key strategic decisions that are likely to impact their effectiveness going forward. Some research that I did recently combed through social media and put together an inventory of pro-housing advocacy groups. These are mostly local organized groups who have various kinds of names and mission statements, but by and large are organized around the idea that current zoning and housing production isn't working. We need more housing and more diverse housing, particularly in high demand locations. So we mapped when these groups were founded. And you can see that there's a real uptick starting about 2016, 2017, that most of the groups that have been formed within the last 5 years. And so this is a very new movement still, and a lot of the groups are still trying to figure out what it is exactly that they're organizing behind and developing more capacity and building relationships to move the political debate. The vast majority of these groups are organized at the local level. So we can see nearly 2/3 of them are locally based, so a city, essentially a city or a county organization. A handful of them are at the broader level focused on either a metropolitan area. A small number of them are explicitly focused at state-level political reforms, particularly in the states where this has been an issue for longer. A handful in big cities are neighborhood level, so they're not even as large as the full city, and only 2 of them really have much of a national mission at this point. So this is still very much a local group. We can see that this has emerged from a couple of the big debates that we've talked about already. So one of the first triggers that got a lot of national attention around the issue of zoning reform was when Minneapolis decided to pass a new comprehensive plan, Minneapolis 2040, that explicitly legalized duplexes and triplexes across the whole city. So this was presented in a couple of different framings. Some of this was about housing affordability and supply. Some of this was about pushing back on long-standing racial disparities between white, Black, and Native households in the city of Minneapolis. The framing here is important because local governments may be pushing for the same kinds of policy changes, but there are a variety of different ways that they can motivate this depending on the constituencies. Because Minneapolis was coming at this very much from a racial equity standpoint, they explicitly framed the victory as ending single-family zoning and pushing back on racial discrimination. That was a framing that got the coalition together, that enabled them to build a group of tenant advocates, affordable housing developers, and other kinds of coalitions in order to pass this. But it's important to recognize that that was specific to their context and that other local and state advocacy groups are thinking about what works for their context. If we map where the pro-housing advocacy groups are, we can see that they show up more frequently in the large coastal metros. That's not all that surprising. These are some of the most expensive places where housing affordability has been salient for a long time. These are also just big cities that have a rich nonprofit ecosystem. They have a lot of political advocacy on other issues. But notice that this is not just about the large coastal cities. There are active pro-housing advocacy groups in places like Orlando, Florida, and in Atlanta, in some of the smaller cities, in Texas. So this is becoming a more widespread movement and is moving outside of the coastal territories into some other areas, particularly some more traditionally red states. And one of the interesting things to watch is which states are starting to propose things and where there are coalitions forming that don't look like the Minneapolis coalition or the longstanding movement in California. So I've pulled just a handful of examples of the less obvious candidates. So Virginia has not yet passed something, but they have proposed legalizing duplexes. There's an active group in Virginia focused on a combination of zoning reform, tenants' rights, and additional funding for traditional affordable housing. So the coalition there is still coming together. North Carolina, another traditionally red state that is starting to push back, and North Carolina's had a number of local successes, including in Raleigh and Charlotte. Utah has passed some fairly ambitious statewide legislation. Maine And Gainesville, Florida, just became the first Florida city to have a citywide zoning reform. So we're seeing a lot more interest from the non-traditional candidates getting engaged with this. Some of them are adopting pretty different political strategies. This is a very locally based movement and not particularly centralized. So if you think about other kinds of nonprofit organizations that have local chapters, something like, for instance, Habitat for Humanity, there's a national umbrella organization and local chapters that provide some coordination and some messaging and some actual support and financial resources. So far, the pro-housing movement doesn't have that. These are groups that are forming across the country, but each one of them are independent. So they develop their own agenda, and they're also learning on their own how to make this work. The closest thing there is to a national force that is encouraging communication and collaboration and knowledge sharing is a semi-regular conference called YIMBY Town. The first YIMBY Town happened in 2016 in Boulder, Colorado. There was one the following year in Oakland, California, then in Boston. There was a gap because of the pandemic, and the most recent one happened in 2022 in Portland, Oregon. The YIMBY Town Conference, it's a little bit misleading because it's the same name, but it's organized by different groups. The host city volunteers a place, does the scheduling. And so although this has been a convening place for the groups, it does not have a unified agenda that it imposes. And there is a lot of variation across years in who shows up to YIMBY Town and what the messages are that come out of that. And this is important thinking about the future of the movement. One of the big questions facing the movement at the moment is whether or not to embrace this term YIMBY for yes in my backyard. Some of the early groups explicitly embraced that because they were pushing back against the not in my backyard NIMBY homeowners. And for some groups, that is still a very powerful framing. The NIMBYs are what we don't want. We want to advocate for more housing, more diverse housing, more racially equitable housing, and that framing works. The YIMBY movement had some early run-ins. There were some not particularly diplomatic members of the YIMBY movement who got into fights with longstanding tenant advocates, failed to build bridges with some of the affordable housing groups that had been in the space earlier. And because of that, in some parts of the country, the term YIMBY has some political baggage. So we have seen more recent groups organizing, choosing not to use the term NIMBY in their name. There's a prevalence of using things like house or housing or home neighbors, and we can see sort of a smattering of the groups that identify as pro-housing advocates, but have chosen a wide range of names to use. So some of these are very local, Greater Washington, Abundant Housing Massachusetts, Neighbors for More Neighbors. That's becoming a fairly popular kind of formulation, and they have a loose network of other groups with the same name. But the messaging and the framing, as well as the name of the group, are a really important part of the likelihood for success in different kinds of political contexts. One of the other sort of messaging issues that the movement is thinking about is how to frame what the policy demand is that they're asking for. So you have probably seen some headlines about ending single-family zoning. That's a popular framing for the media and for some pro-housing advocates, particularly those who are leading with a racial equity framework. Single-family exclusive zoning is very bad for low-income households, is bad for Black and Latino households who mostly rent their homes. So ending single-family zoning is a step towards racial equity and integration. On the other hand, ending single-family zoning to a lot of people who don't live in the zoning space sounds like ending single-family homes or banning single-family homes. And so a combination of good faith misunderstanding the terms and then some NIMBYs who choose to use that and say the pro-housing movement, the YIMBY movement, wants to ban single-family houses. They want to take away your single-family homes. They're out to destroy our neighborhoods. This is a framing that can be weaponized fairly easily, and people don't necessarily know the difference. So the Sightline Institute, which has been spending a lot of time thinking about the marketing aspect of this, has suggested using a positive framing, and the yard sign I've chosen here shows you some of the ways this can be framed. In our neighborhood, density means diversity. More neighbors equals more fun. ADUs, accessory dwelling units, are awesome. Renters are welcome. This city is for everyone. So this is very much the shift that's ongoing. Some groups are choosing on a positive framing, avoiding the end single-family zoning framing altogether. Although in practice, the policy changes they're asking for are quite similar, but the framing and the messaging matters. So in this chapter, we have talked about the growing pro-housing movement, how recent it is, where it's emerging, and some of the messaging and framing challenges they're likely to face. This is still happening in real time, and so it's not clear where this is going. The question is whether this new and energetic movement is going to be able to push back against the defenders of the status quo, both the entrenched homeowner NIMBYs and addressing the concerns of some of the supply skeptics, affordable housing advocates who worry about gentrification and displacement.